afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Personal Data and Identity webinar, loquaciously entitled, How Can the Identity and Access Management Industry Accelerate the Evolution of an Internet Identity Layer Fit for the 21st Century? I probably should have taken 2 breaths for that title, quite long. But today we're going to talk about the current identity and authentication paradigm. What happens today in terms of IAM and what is wrong with it, what's right with it, and within that we'll talk about username and passwords, social logins, data breaches, the need for businesses to hold and store customer personal data that is inherently vulnerable to theft, etc. We will also touch upon the outlook for the digital economy post-COVID-19, if there is no significant change in digital identity and what that might mean. We'll talk a bit about what can or should governments and regulators be doing to help the industry, given the inherent complexity of the identity marketplace and the potential barriers to the digital economy. Looking ahead, we'll discuss what developments like self-sovereign identity with a distributed ledger or blockchain capability have to offer the industry and wider society in general. And if that is a consideration and a front runner, very importantly, when will that type of solution be available? From a business perspective, I'll be asking my guests what they feel about should be the most crucial components or qualities that any globally ubiquitous identity solution must have if it's going to work and gain widespread acceptance. And lastly, I'm going to talk, or hopefully we'll talk a bit about what NEF and other similar organisations in the space should be doing to help accelerate change in this area in the most effective manner. Now, luckily for all of you watching this webinar, I'm not going to even attempt to answer any of these questions, but rather I'm both fortunate enough and honoured to be joined by some distinguished guests who are really going to do all the hard work for us. So in my first webinar, where alliteration features so strongly in the first names of my guests, I'm delighted to be joined from Washington, DC in the US, by Judah Levine, the CEO of both HIP Consult and Mondato, from London by the Tech Product Strategy and Data Specialist, Figueras, and from deepest Berkshire, I think I've got that right, Julian, the CEO of digime and board member of NEF. All of whom I respectfully ask if you could introduce yourselves and briefly outline your interest in the subjects under discussion for today's webinar attendees. So with that, Judah, could you kick us off, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ian, for the introduction, and looking forward to an interesting discussion today. So my name is Judah Levine. I'm the CEO of Mondato, as well as sister company HIP Consult. Mondato is a specialty advisory firm focused on fintech and digital finance and commerce. This is a worldwide topic. I would say, though, that from a specialization standpoint, we've been doing significant amounts of work in emerging markets, but also developed ones. And in terms of the relevance of this subject matter, depending on how you look at it, identity verification, authentication, sort of the wider topic of identity management can be seen as an enabler, or also a form of friction for the evolution of a lot of the digital transformation and the uptake of digital services, many of which we're all familiar with, but many of which are still to come. And also the level of penetration of these services across different markets varies greatly as part of this issue that we're dealing with today. So our particular interest in this topic is really trying to understand, unpack, and anticipate how it can be best addressed in order to enable more and more people to experience sort of all the digital has to offer. And I think this resonates even more strongly amid the unfortunate pandemic that we're all dealing with currently. Thank you.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you, Judah. Jessica, hi, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Hi, so I'm a tech market strategist and industry analyst, researcher. I've been focused on government, policy and politics in particular. And so digital identity has been an area of research interest for me for many years. In kind of previous gigs, I spent a lot of time studying the UK government's attempts to get to grips with this and to provide a workable solution for the UK. Did they do that? No, I don't think they did. But it's really interesting to me now how this whole issue has become so much more than what it started off with, which was just fundamentally a bit of enterprise plumbing, right? For anybody who had something to gatekeep, this was just about how you protected resources. It was an enterprise problem. What's it turned into today? It's turned into a societal issue, actually. And I think this is something that we have to get to grips with right now, because we are already going through a absolutely enormous transformation of our economies and our societies as a result of what's happening with COVID, but also all of the trends we've seen in recent years. The very rapid rise of online life, the rise of a ad tech economy. So I think there are a lot of these issues which are really coming together now, and I do think digital identity is kind of at the centre of it, actually. So that's why it's of interest to me.
Great, thank you. And thank you for saving me saying anything about the UK government's efforts on identity. Julian, please, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Julian Ranger. I'm the exec chairman and founder of a company called digime. We're what you might think of in identity terms as a personal wallet, but we're much more than that. What we enable an individual to do is get a full copy of all their personal data, so much wider than what we might think classically identity. So for example, all my health records, all my wearables, all my social posts, every financial transaction, etc. Video and the rest, all held by the individual, only by the individual. So in the sense of the phrase self-sovereign, they own it, hold it. And then we provide a full consent stack with consent certificates so that any business, government, or any entity can ask the individual for data. And if the individual says yes, then that data flows. So we basically treat the individual as the only point of integration of all of their data. And it enables a richer data flow for new services or improved services, but with privacy, security, and consent. Now, as I said, we cover any data, so therefore that can cover identity and other verified credentials, which is why we have an interest in this area and long-standing interest. The interesting thing for me is how we fundamentally move forwards from a situation of username, password, digitally, a more manual, usually less digital, but a little digital verification process if required. We don't always need to be more than just a returning human. And how we step forwards to something that is more convenient, more distributed, and ensure that we're only giving up the data we need to give up when we are logging on, etc. But that will all come out of today. So looking forward to it.
So, given that we have now considerably less than 60 minutes to solve one of the most complex and weighty matters known to man, or certainly this man, can I suggest that we would just dive straight in with our first topic or question? And that is today's identity and authentication paradigm. What works and what doesn't? And here I'm talking about username and password, how that has developed and where it's today, the use of social logins, the really unfortunate preponderance, increasing preponderance, it seems, of data breaches. ZJ was one certainly involved with very recently, all sorts of stuff going on. I think, Julian, you are, I suppose, to the industry and all of this stuff that's happening. Could you perhaps start by just giving us a quick overview of how you see the IAM industry today, and what works and what doesn't?
Sure. I think probably a good point of departure for that question is the fact that a lot of people don't know what IAM is, right? So we're dealing with a very specific corner of an ecosystem which is highly impactful and important for the rest of the ecosystem, but it's a small part of the ecosystem with tentacles across most areas of it. And fundamentally, if we think about this really in two different parts, for individuals and for companies to engage in services, digital services, but also services that are offline, there needs to be a certain level of confidence in the systems. There needs to be a certain level of trust. And the beauty of the identity system, the initial efforts, and really to a great extent, still the prevailing mechanisms for us to interface with different systems is their ubiquity and their simplicity. So we all understand the concept of putting in basic login information, and some of us are becoming better familiar with multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, or we get that annoying message on our phone or in some other medium requiring us to sort of put in additional information. And the process of getting authenticated to interact with different services is fairly straightforward. The problem, which we've all become familiar with, is the system doesn't work so well from a technical perspective. It's very easy to hack. It's very easy to have massive amounts of fraud. And so on the one hand, the beauty of the simplicity is undermined by the fact that we lose confidence and trust in this system, both from a consumer perspective as well as from a service provider perspective, as we have more and more of these issues come up. And there's many other types of issues surrounding it. So clearly, pardon me, clearly there needs to be some sort of improved alternative for this. And when we start seeking out alternatives, it becomes very much a discussion that is grounded in a lot of issues of policy, of process, of different types of technologies, and also multiple actors. Who owns the information that I'm entering? So one of the introductions here by Julian was talking about sort of like having sort of the personal wallet of data or information, identifying information. And there's a big movement towards that. But while we're still sort of looking to do that, we have a situation where identity fundamentally at its purest form is owned by governments. And the process of adding to the file of identity and then managing who has this information is still very much a moving process. And it's a constant sort of discussion that's being had. And it involves a lot of complexity and a lot of potential actors. And in order to get sort of movement on a scaled basis towards an alternative mechanism, we need to have two parties, really, two groups of parties buy in. On one hand, we need to have the users understand what we're doing and accept it and adopt it en masse. On the other hand, we have to have those who are meant to accept this alternative path towards identity verification and authentication also buy in. So that means that banks and hospitals and tax agencies and other players that are involved on the other side also embrace. And sort of like we're trying to achieve the two in parallel while introducing new technologies, distributed ledger, blockchain, and other technologies into the equation. And so it creates sort of a hub of noise and activity, which is all occurring in parallel. And to have a viable, trusted, and embraced alternative emerge out of this will take some effort, and it will take some sort of coordination, and the stakes are extremely high. Because if we don't achieve this, we're sort of stuck in this sort of middle phase, which we neither have resolved the legacy issues of the fully ubiquitous and embraced but highly problematic system, but we also are not realizing the potential benefits of the alternatives that we're all speaking of. And so this purgatory phase is the one that we're going to really try and break out of, as soon as possible. And certainly what's occurring with COVID is an expediting event, because now we have also this additional factor of so many people being confined and having to engage with systems remotely versus the in-person sort of ability to validate and authenticate individuals, which adds another catalyst and another level of complexity which needs to be addressed in short order.
Sorry, Jessica, the same question really over to you in terms of today's identity and authentication paradigm. What's good about it? What's not good about it?
So I don't want to repeat the points that Judah made. So I just wanted to add that I think the current paradigm, was designed for commercial use cases. It was designed around the need to, carry out commercial transactions online. It was designed for government services, tax and benefits, that sort of thing. It wasn't designed for peer-to-peer citizen use cases, and I think this is the really new and interesting thing that we're seeing now with COVID. It doesn't really facilitate simple acts of trust, like who's allowed to come into my group therapy class online. I hear loads of stories actually about this sort of stuff, and if you think how many simple acts of trust that we usually will carry out on a daily basis in offline life, so much of that stuff is having to move online now. We look at how, in the UK, pubs and other venues are being asked to capture details of customers for COVID tracing purposes. We're hearing stories about women being contacted by bar staff afterwards using the details. ICO here in the UK has really gone out of his way to try to make it easy for organisations to capture that data. They're being told, it's fine to have just a guest book. We're seeing all of the many downsides. And the current paradigm also, let's not forget, it excludes large parts of the population. So digital exclusion was something we were talking about before COVID. To my mind, we weren't talking about it half enough. But now this stuff is urgent. When we have large numbers of elderly people, people without internet access, people without bank accounts, people without passports, people without an affixed address. These people are excluded from even more of life than they were already. And so again, the paradigm wasn't created for these scenarios. So I think this is something else that we need to think about as we hopefully move towards a better paradigm. How are we going to make it really, really socially inclusive?
Okay, thank you. And Julian, same question.
Yes, I like to sort of differentiate, because we talk about identity and nearly always we go straight into verification, formal identity. This is definitely Julian Ranger of this address, of this birth date, of this passport number. But actually the vast majority of our interactions don't have that level of verification. They're just a returning human. Now they're a returning human with building history. And for most people, usernames and passwords actually work. They're not the greatest, though, with security, as we know, but they're simple. And the problem we've got, in a large respect, when we're looking at replacing anything or improving it, sharing better data, being in more control, not having to repeat verification of the same data, those types of things that we want to do, is we forget the ease and convenience of the current system. You'd say it isn't very easy. I have tons of usernames and passwords, but you know what? These days with browsers and everything else, most of them are remembered. It's not too difficult. So as we're moving forwards, one of the challenges is doing something and getting that user buy-in, right? Because if there's any friction, no one's going to adopt it. Businesses won't adopt it because friction means identity is a means to something else, some other transaction happening. And so we have to make it frictionless. And of course, if we make it harder, as Jessica's just pointed out, we're going to get worse digital exclusion. And I think that actually is the core of why there will be issues with SSI and self-sovereign identity and some of the things going forward, because it hasn't been thought out how that comes in and is made easy. But the promise, what we want, is something that is obviously secure. We want it to be convenient. We want it to minimize the data to only that which we need to exchange for the purpose we're exchanging, right? And we want it to be fairly ubiquitous. So these are all things we'd love to have, but we've got to make it convenient, and there has to be a marginal benefit to doing anything new. What is it that I'm getting extra? Now, I think there are new things, particularly in other verified credentials, training records, all sorts of other reasons why we want to exchange data, not just who I am. But I'll keep coming back to the convenience. And I do think there's a way out, because somebody mentioned, you know, we've got to get governments to agree. I actually think we can't move forwards until we get governments to change on the way that they're going to provide for verified identity, the source documents, and until regulators agree, because they're all to do with the use, right, that we're allowed to do other things digitally. So we've got to bring both of those in. But if we do, I think we'll simplify things moving downstream. I don't think they need to be technology providers, by the way. So I've never agreed with UK Verify on that type of basis, right? But we'll come to that more downstream. I'll leave it at that.
Yes, that's great. You've hit on a couple of really interesting points that I'd like to come back to. But staying with the user experience question, the perspective, from a business perspective, what do you feel? And I think we're perhaps all coming at this from a slightly different angle. So I am interested in all of your takes on this. From a business's perspective, what would you? So you're running your own business. What do you think are the most crucial components or qualities that any globally ubiquitous identity solution really must have? You know, for me, you know, the UX, the usability, the security, you know, those sorts of issues. Jessica, can I go to you first on that?
So there needs to be the legal context, right, around you know, liability, consumer protection. I think that's absolutely critical. You know, I want to see that it provides me with some protection as well as the citizen, and it, you know, it needs to support that relationship of trust rather than undermine it. So I think there needs to be some kind of transparency built in. You know, what exactly is being exchanged, what is being shared, what's going to be done with it. I think another, perhaps not from the point of view of an individual business, but I think another couple of things I'd like to see is yeah, the ability to work across borders, which is another reason why the legal status needs to be really recognised. And very importantly, that it should be free and open to build on. So we don't want to see yet more private monopolies. I think we've got enough now. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Jessica. Julian, back to you very quickly. I know you have a.
No, I've already talked about ease of use.
Yeah.
It's interesting that I'll also say control of data sharing, because when we are doing it, even whether returning human or verified, we need to make sure we're only sharing that data we need, data minimization. But that doesn't, by the way, mean less data. I actually believe in a world where we're all going to share much, much, much more data. We're going to need to for personalized health and other things, but we need to be in control and understand and only share that which we need for that item. Now, a classic example of something, if you don't worry about verified data, so not talking KYC for banks or something, is, you know what, Apple's ID, the new Apple ID, is pretty much a good example of something that's very easy, isn't it? Right? I can just sign in with that, put my thumb on my phone, it's pretty done, I don't have to remember anything, it's simple, not leaking data to anyone. That's a really high bar, but it doesn't do some of the things we've said. It doesn't enable me to share more data, some other stuff, it doesn't provide verifications. But in terms of capability, there's a high bar in something like that for what we have to duplicate with the other pieces that we're doing. But I think the other thing is, when we do talk about verified identity, the ability to reuse it, which is the critically difficult problem that we can't do. Right? It's absolutely crazy that we have to still go in person to all the banks and show all the data, and then do exactly the same the next day to buy a phone, and exactly the same the next day to do something else. But the problem with that is, because it costs so much, who's going to be the first to open up and things like that? And that's where governments will come in.
Okay, thank you. Apple ID, that's an interesting point. Certainly from my perspective, you know, my immediate reaction is, do I want a tech giant, you know, being the sole not arbiter or sole you know, wielder of my identity? You know, I'm not particularly comfortable with that. So sort of I suppose the same question, Judah, really from yourself. What, from your perspective, in terms of a globally ubiquitous identity solution? Of course, there isn't such a thing at the moment, but let's dream. What are the most crucial components or qualities that you would like to see in it?
Well, I think maybe I'll approach the question from how it started, which was from a corporate perspective and company perspective, because I think it's a little bit easier than going towards the ubiquitous. I think from a company and corporate standpoint, you're looking to have almost, what is the bare minimum of friction, i.e. verification, authentication, that you need to go through in order to enable your current and addressable market to access your services. Really, that's what you're trying to do. And there's an optimization exercise here. If you are the absolute most secure, if you put up barriers which are insurmountable, then that clearly doesn't serve your commercial interest. And if you're putting in a pathway which anyone and everyone can access, then that once again doesn't serve your interest. And so you have to have a basis for putting forth a process and system which finds that happy meeting point between risk management that is appropriate for your sort of area of activity. So clearly, if you're a bank, the stakes are really, really high versus, you know, if you're selling vegetables online. So you need to really have something that's appropriate for you. And therein lies a little bit of the challenge with part B of your question, which is making things globally ubiquitous and comfortable for everyone. The answer is that's not possible, not on day one, right? You need to sort of create islands of entry point and sort of levels of comfort and embrace, which gradually move towards a global standard. If you're, you know, the so-called, if you're trying to go for perfect, you're not going to end up with good, right? So if you're able to establish areas that are reasonably solid and an improvement, you're providing a pragmatic mechanism to climb your way towards something which is more ubiquitous. And I'll give the example of, Jessica touched on cross-border. Cross-border is super important. And also when we look at things like remittance systems and value transfer between countries, one of the issues is that every single country has a different standard for some of these very basic issues, even what identity is. What is identity? I might have a different definition in the US than the UK, than Nigeria, and so forth, right? And so one of the ways to try to move in that direction is in a bilateral and multi-party basis. And gradually, I think we start rallying around commonality, and I hope we get to the ideal, but I will settle for a few goods along the way.
Right, that's the pragmatic view. Thank you. Yeah, because, you know, the idea that there will be a globally ubiquitous system that we all use is certainly a long way off. So yeah, I take your point on that. Thank you. So moving on, I've got a few questions in. I'm going to come to those in a little while. I want to get the bulk of the main sort of points out of the way first. And thank you all for those. I will come to those as soon as I can. So moving on to our next question for the panel. And it touches again on some of what we talked about here. A lot of the, I worked on, you know, for the GSMA for a number of years on a project for mobile network operators called Mobile Connect. And it was that sort of gradually the scales fell from my eyes, and I saw exactly well, not exactly. I started to get a feel for exactly how complex a subject, this is to solve. We talk about identity and authentication. It's not necessary for me in the vast majority of transactions that I do online to prove my identity, but to prove that I am who I say I am within within the realm of a particular transaction, so that that company has faith that I am who I say I am and they're going to get paid. That's the principal question. And the GSMA, I think, used levels of assurance 1 to 4. I think probably went from 1 to 6 eventually. And your use case would slot into that. Now, that creates a huge amount of complexity. And I quite like the idea, or there is an attractiveness about the idea of a return to first principles. And that is one where the identity attributes, the core identity attributes, so for example your passport, as it would be in the real world, your passport, your birth certificate, your driving license, those sorts of things sit with the citizen, with the consumer. So bearing that in mind, and here we're obviously talking about self-sovereign identity, what, in the view of the panel, the developments like self-sovereign identity with a distributed ledger or blockchain capability for identity attribute verification have to offer the industry and wider society in general? And very importantly, if that is possible, when might a workable framework for that evolve? Julian, would you like to kick us off with that?
Yeah, and so I like the concept of SSI, but I dislike the fact that it's always linked to blockchain. That's just a technological piece, and there are many different ways that SSI can be done. So we have a tendency in the tech community sometimes to fall in love with technology and not fall in love with what it's providing. And I think this is one of those cases. But me holding the core documents for verification, absolutely. That, I think, by the way, is the single biggest thing that will change everything in the right direction. Why? I can log on today to the UK government website. I can apply for a new passport, do everything electronically, and get my passport sent to me on the post. Why can't I therefore have an API where my government passport is given back to me electronically, and it can be stored in anything, stored in a digime, it can be stored in somebody else's wallet, and then it can be presented digitally with any biometrics needed to prove that it's me. Actually more secure than using a paper passport, right? Because it's electronic and everything else, and I had to get it that way. Now, if you can therefore persuade governments just to make APIs available for their source documents, nothing else, not very complicated, driving licenses, passports, birth certificates. Yes, you'll have to qualify the companies that are allowed to connect, but you'll have a multiplicity of them, so there's not a monopoly. That's pretty international. My passports, we've already agreed that pretty much internationally. And if I have the source documents, it takes away a large amount of this problem of repeat verification. Now, of course, regulators then have to allow digital presentation of the documents, not paper, right? And they have to allow digital records that the bank or whoever it was to saw it. But in that sense, that is the big change that I think will work. Now, whether or not it's done by systems that use blockchains or systems that use other systems or whatever else, who cares? The market will sort that out, right? I'm not in love with one or the other. Now, obviously I'm representing digime, but there's plenty of different companies doing similar sorts of things. But if we don't do that, we're stuck. Because if at the end of the day, a company X does the digital verification of me, and even if they provide me a copy of that, the relying party has to know who the digital party X is, and there has to be a contractual relationship and everything else. It doesn't move forwards. We're in the same mess we are today, even though I hold it. But if we actually transfer the root of trust from the government to the individual, provided you know that it hasn't been modified, right? Now that's a very different game. And that's the game, I think, that will accelerate where we're going. And that could happen 2, 3, 4 years. And the only reason it's 2, 3, or 4 years is wait, which governments are going to do it first. And I really, really hope, as one of the other panelists said, that COVID accelerates that particular thing.
Yes, let's hope so. So that's quite an interesting point, Judah, to yourself. So the SSI side, is that a runner from your perspective, particularly around the blockchain element, or are we barking up the wrong tree?
I don't think it's barking up the wrong tree. We're barking up a tree, and it's a tree that's complex. And you ask anyone about the intricacies of blockchain and how it's applied to all these different use cases, and you'll get as many answers as you have individuals you're polling. So it's a promising path. It's a path that's getting regular and constant and growing attention, and the use cases that are being devised and explored are also increasing. I think it's promising. I don't think it's near term going to be impactful in a ubiquitous manner, because it's still to a great extent in the experimental and adoption phase. And I don't know how far in the adoption phase it is, but I would conjure early to medium if you want to be generous. I think the example given by Julian, where effectively you're accepting that government credentials are still overwhelmingly the foundational pillar for proof of identity, and reasonably accepted across borders. And interestingly enough, I think the International Civil Aviation Organization is probably the only supranational level accepted formal identity at this stage. Otherwise, it's just chaos and debate. So that works well, right? Because you're basically taking something which is fundamentally accepted, and also we accept the monopoly of states and countries to provide identity to individuals, and you're transferring it to a digital mechanism. You're giving additional control to the individual through APIs. So I would constitute that as a reasonable and fairly easy, in the context of things, on-ramp to that process. Are there additional on-ramps and other additional paths? Absolutely, there are, but they increasingly get more complex and involve more actors and debate as you go along. So I like that idea of creating practical on-ramps. And in terms of, you know, self-sovereignty, again, subject to debate. What exactly does that mean? And who are the actors involved, and how much control are you giving to the individual, and how much control can the individual sort of how quickly can they take on that additional knowledge and how to interface with those systems and utilize that most effectively. I think that will come in time. So that's a recognition that there is a process and timeline to achieving this, and it needs to be a pragmatic one. I want to add just one more nuance to this, which is, remember, a lot of these things we're talking about work really well for those that are already inside of the system, those that are either in developed markets or those sort of from the middle to sort of the better healed in emerging markets. But in many cases, you have individuals that don't have identity papers, right? And so there's a whole other category within this discussion that are underrepresented, which is those who are still struggling to get an identity in the first instance. And there have been various blockchain applications that have been experimented with in order to try and address that. In some cases, some parts have been successful, others have been shown to have some challenges that need to be addressed. But when we think of on-ramps, we also need to think of that first on-ramp, which is getting that essential kernel of identity for some individuals.
Great, thank you, Judah. Jessica, moving to you, I'd like to sort of move on from that a little bit. So still thinking really about self-sovereign identity, you know, there's a really interesting corollary between self-sovereign identity and, you know, the world we inhabit, the physical world where I have a passport, I have a birth certificate, etc. I suppose what Julian is, correct me if I'm wrong, Julian, but, you know, what you're proposing is that we replicate that real world situation in the digital world to work in, you know, a very similar way. But I'd like to frame a slightly different question for yourself. So from a societal perspective, if nothing else, assuming that the political will can be summoned, and that is a huge question, you know, in itself, what can or should governments do to help industry drive a new solution, given the inherent complexity of what we've been talking about?
So I think the single biggest thing actually that governments could do is to actually enforce the current data protection laws. I mean, it might sound a bit obvious and simplistic, but the point is right now is that it's not expensive enough for organisations to hold personal data, you know. And it's really not in particularly as at a point at which we have developed such a massive ad tech economy, martech economy, you know, companies making money, or perhaps probably not quite so much money as we think they do, through, you know, various forms of kind of broking data. It's in no one's interest to kind of shake that up. So yeah, the number one thing they could do is government could do is actually enforce the law. You know, I think we should recognise that the significant externalities that are produced by our current paradigm, and there frankly should be a kind of polluter pays principle at stake. So I think that's the first thing. I think that in itself would go a long way, I think. And I totally agree with Julian's ask in terms of providing easy access to source government documents. It seems an absolute no-brainer, doesn't it? I suppose it's. I saw some encouraging noises this morning from Ministry of Housing and Local Government here in the UK, which is wanting to move the planning system from one based on documents to one based on data. So that, to me, sounds like we're moving in the right direction, slowly.
Slowly, yes. That's great. Thank you, Jessica. So before we move on, I've got a bit of a, not a plethora quite, but certainly quite a few questions from attendees for the panelists, principally around the self-sovereign. There's a couple of questions here. So this is from Chris Lee. Question for all the panelists: is there a viable business model for self-sovereign identity? Sovereign Foundation recently had, pardon me, sustainability issues and had to downsize its staff. Looking back, what could you say Sovereign could or should have done differently as a leading organisation for SSI? Anyone want to pick that one?
Yes, and I know the people behind Sovereign very well, so I don't want to take this as a criticism. Remember, all founders of everything recognise the mistakes after the event, and we make plenty of them. And I have made more than my fair share. So
2020 hindsight, yeah.
With the benefit of 2020 hindsight. I think there was too much time spent in the technology stack issues. And if we build this wonderful technology, we'll find the use cases and everything else to go with it. And I keep coming back to, you've got to find a use case that makes it easier and better for both sides of the argument first, and then hopefully your technology will make that use case work. And I think there was too much love for the technology and not enough love for the use cases. And as Jessica said, it seems like a no-brainer for governments. But actually, do you know what? I've not seen my involvement in the identity industry. I don't see a crowd of people knocking on the government door saying, where's the passport systems API? It should be.
Yeah, it really should
be. Do you know what? There's a whole working group on storing driving licenses, even in Kantara, and I'm a board member of Kantara. But surely the simplest thing should be knock on the door, can we have an API for my driving licenses, please? It's the simplest, it's not complicated, but unfortunately we've got a tendency to love technology and not love the simple answers sometimes.
And there's a great parallel there, I think, with my final question: what should MEF and other organisations be doing to accelerate change in the most effective manner? So perhaps there's a bit of a lesson for us in that. Sorry, so another question I have, right, sorry. So Claudine Bell from Telefonica O2 UK. Hi, Claudine. I gather you're in deepest Berkshire as well. Your question is, what part should mobile network operators play in identity, given the relative failure of the GSMA's Mobile Connect to gain widespread adoption? Thank you for that. Yeah, would anyone like to pick that up?
I can potentially help with that one. We deal with telecom and mobile operators a lot. So mobile operators are probably, arguably the second biggest potential producer or supporter of identity in the world, second to governments, in that they have to go through a fairly, well, it really depends on the country, right? Again, getting to the many different standards applied globally. But in more and more countries, you need to verify who your customer is. And in many countries, and this has been an issue in emerging markets quite a lot over the past several years, you need to identify in person who that person is. So you actually have to go, you have to show up before you'll get your SIM card and be able to get access to the mobile network. And heavens forbid if a mobile operator doesn't comply with this, as we saw, for example, with MTN in Nigeria, you can potentially get hit with huge fines. And that's not the only place stuff like that has occurred. So the interesting thing for mobile operator is through that process, as well as through some of the offerings that they have, for example, airtime top-up credits, and then moving that whole credit system to other forms of digital, and even expanding outside their own mobile operator ecosystem to enable third parties to tap into their information in order to verify that customers are suitable for their offerings. You're basically having the development of ecosystems of authentication that are anchored in the mobile operator's control of the user data, and the increasing data as the user keeps using the service, because they're spitting off information on their recharges and their use of different types of value-added services, as well as the core services of the operator. So there's a very interesting opportunity here for mobile operators to really, at the very least, complement and feed into the formal identity systems and accentuate, grow the file of data and the ability of many more people to enter this system, because their footprint in many cases is bigger than the government's footprint in terms of the people that they serve relative to the people that have identification. There is pushback from most governments in this. And so I think the GSMA's effort was a good one, and something needs to occur around that front. And maybe it happens on a country by country basis, where there's structured engagement between the mobile operators, probably as a group in a given country, and the government, in terms of trying to support the existing systems rather than challenge them, and then find a basis for collaboration that builds trust between the parties. And I think in time that allows for really supporting both spheres, bringing more people into the identity fold, but then also allowing them to benefit from some of these alternative mechanisms for authentication, and from the simple ones to the more complex ones, in creating national ecosystems, which a lot of these mobile operators are ultimately multinational. So hopefully that also helps expedite the cross-border harmonization of approaches. You may be on mute, Ian.
I beg your pardon, started again. So mobile network operators have been in a pretty thankless position. They really were possibly at the center, or they could have been really at the center of digital identity moving forward. However, they are very heavily regulated, and that's a real plus. If I have a problem with my network operator, I know exactly where they are. I can go and find them. I can sue them if possible. That's not quite the same for a lot of the tech giants that are looking to play in this space. Jessica, I'm not sure how much interaction you've had with mobile network operators, but do you feel as though MNOs have a role to play in identity moving forward?
So yeah, so it's interesting. So when you asked that question, my mind went back in history. It felt like a very deja vu moment. I remember writing a research report in, I think, 2005 with a colleague, where we argued that MNOs should become identity providers. And I remember at the time, you know, kind of older grey colleagues saying to us, oh no, it'll never happen. And that's been suggested, it'll never happen. You know, kind of fresh-faced, idealistic, you know, we were absolutely convinced that this was the obvious way forward for MNOs, you know. And over the years, you know, many other reports have been written by other fresh-faced, idealistic analysts suggesting the same. And I've sat there saying, oh, it'll never work, they'll never do it. I don't know what it is about the kind of culture and the setup with telcos. Yeah, I don't know. We've been talking about it for such a long time, haven't we? And it just doesn't seem to happen.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Julian, do you have a final viewpoint on that?
No, I think it's been said. I shall not add to the MNO discussion.
Okay, that's very adept of you. Okay. So one of my, well, not quite at my final question, but I suppose this is a general one for the panel and the attendees as well. You know, if you have a question on this, what do you think the outlook is for the digital economy post this sort of pandemic, you know, that we're in? I'm not saying after, you know, COVID-19, but during this, you know, really significant change that we've seen to life, you know, being transacted more and more online. What's the outlook for the digital economy if we don't solve this issue? You know, usernames and passwords, if you're in the industry, the phrase username and password is broken will not be a new one to you. But having said that, we're all still using it with two-factor authentication that's improving sort of security levels and stuff like that. Is there a problem? Are we in danger of, you know, trying to develop a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, but you know, we can carry on with, you know, perfectly reasonably well? Are we worrying too much about, you know, the inherent problems of today's identity paradigm? Whoever wants to jump into that.
Well, I listened to Matt Hancock speaking the other day at a lecture he was doing. As our health minister, if not everybody knows who he is, and of course, if you know Matt Hancock, he does know technology. Now, it doesn't matter what his politics is. And he was sort of saying, well, at last, we've broken through some of the taboos. You know, if I'd have said I wanted everyone to have digital consultations, I'd have been told that was 5 to 10 years. Well, it's here now and it's bloody well staying. If I was told we needed to do some other things, then it would have been 5, 10 years. Well, it's here now and we're going on. So I'd like to think that COVID has brought a realization that we can do things and can do them quickly and effectively if we put our minds to it. Unfortunately, the downsides is looking at governments who have been anything but fast and efficient with their pieces during the whole COVID thing. And it's difficult, you know, when you're in government and you've got these things, but you've got these massive organizations. So whilst we came up earlier with a discussion saying how obvious it is that government should open up the APIs to this, that, and the other, and it isn't a difficult job to do, the question is whether that will now, post-COVID, take 2, 3, 4 years to convince, write loads of papers, have 500,000 consultants consult on it before we then come up with a proposal and we then create a massive framework, or whether somebody will just say, hey, let's just create an API, guys, and get on with it. I'm hoping the latter. I'm frightened that we will revert to type.
Okay. And wrapping up, just a sort of outlook for the digital economy. Jessica?
So I find, so Julian's passport example is really interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking passports, that's the Home Office. Driver's license, that's DVLA, isn't it? So, so what you find is that different parts of government are more or less happy to share and be open. And for some reason, the transport part is actually very, very up with open data and sharing, and that they're good at creating those ecosystems. The Home Office is the ultimate organisation that does not want to share, and you can see why, can't you? There's a kind of cultural paranoia actually there about security. It's literally that's their job, you know, and so they keep this stuff to themselves. So I think, you know, in a word, the outlook for the economy is going to be patchy, right? There are going to be some use cases, I think, where we probably will see progress and we'll see really interesting things happening. And I think there'll be others where, frankly, we will be stuck in the dark ages for the foreseeable.
Okay, thank you. And Judah, yourself lastly, so what's the downside of us not getting this right, do you think?
On the balance, I think COVID makes us move faster. And I think it's an inevitable outcome of the situation that we're in. And I don't think that the downside is we don't move so fast. We don't move as fast as we could. But I think there's so much vested interest and there's so much vested need in addressing the undeniable requirement to move more services online and to be able to engage with between consumers and customers and service providers in different ways, that this will happen. And it is happening, and it's going to keep happening, and it'll happen fast. And if governments put up sort of roadblocks, the industry will work as best as it can at getting around them. And so really, it's just a question of whether this is as efficient and optimized and speed up process as possible, or not quite, but we're still moving in the right direction.
Yeah, great, thank you. Judah, it feels right to me somehow that a return to, for want of a better phrase, first principles is required given the complexity of the industry that we're in. And I do believe there's something in this trying to replicate what we have in the real world, you know, that Julian suggested of the digital version of our passports, you know, those bedrock identity attributes, you know, being in the possession of the citizen consumer. I really feel there's something in that. That's perhaps something that we can explore on a further webinar. I did have a couple of other questions, and there are a few questions, unfortunately, that I haven't been able to get round to in the time. Firstly, I would like to thank all of the people who attended or are viewing this webinar around the world. There's quite a few of you. Thank you very much for joining us today. August is always an interesting month for webinars to see how many people would get on, and I'm delighted we had so many today. Thank you very much for your interactions. Secondly, I'd very much like to thank my esteemed panel, Judah Levine from Washington, D.C., Jessica Figueras. I always have a problem with your surname. It's the Jessica and the Figueras together. Always gets me. My apologies for that. From South London, thank you very much. And Julian from deepest Berkshire, thank you very much indeed for your contributions today.
Ian, can I just interrupt you and say this would be a perfect time for those questions that we haven't answered to remind everybody of the PD&I working group, which they can join and therefore explore these questions in much more detail.
Yeah, you've done my job for me. Thank you very much, Julian. I was just going on to, if you have any specific questions that haven't been answered by this webinar, please feel free to reach out to me directly at Iain, which is IAIN, at mobileecosystemforum.com. It's a bit of a lengthy email, so it's Iain, IAIN, at mobileecosystemforum.com. But please, if you or your business are involved in the identity sector, MEF and the personal data identity program really would benefit from your experience. Please get in touch and I can talk to you about the work that we do here. What do we have? So we have our next PD&I webinar at some point in September. I'm not quite sure of the date of that, but that will go around in an email following this. So thank you very much to everyone tuning in, and thank you very much to my guests today. Your participation very much appreciated. Thanks very much indeed, all. Cheers. Take care. Be safe.
Yeah.